Ian Bremmer is standing by. Ian, great to have you back on the show. It's a pleasure as always.
Hey.
Let's start with some Brexit. Are there surprises still left in the tank?
I don't think so. I mean, look, it's always possible until a new EU-UK deal is inked that it falls apart. But the fact that Boris Johnson has a strong majority in Parliament right now, and that he is ideologically, let's say, flexible, it's a nice way of putting it in terms of what the outcome is going to be, should make people feel much more comfortable that we do get to a deal. The big issue has been, of course, the last 4 years, and the fact the UK economies have been on a much worse trajectory because of that uncertainty, because a lot of jobs have been going away. I think that uncertainty really diminishes dramatically as of this week.
All right, so we finally, after 4 years, basically, can we move on from it? I guess there's obviously still the deal to be ironed out, but are the ranges of that outcome narrowed? Is that essentially the message?
Yeah, I think the range of the outcome are pretty narrow. I think the likelihood it gets done is much higher. Everybody feels pretty oriented towards it. Of course, the UK has a big lift, not just with the EU, but also it needs to now remake trade agreements with everybody, right? I mean, it was the European Union that had that trade-making authority. Now that all goes back to the UK, they've had to create that capacity from scratch. I mean, they're a smart government. It's not as if they don't know how to walk and chew gum, but you know, creating an entire trade division of a government and building a world worth of international arrangements, that's not something that you do in 1 year. It's going to take a long time.
Yeah. Let's run down through the list basically of political and just geo concerns that have arisen. I want to just try and see how you view from your perspective as a politics analyst and a geopolitics analyst, what is this coronavirus thing going to do in terms of relationships, China's image on the global stage? Are there any ramifications in your side of the world of what's happening right now?
Sure. The fact that we can't trust data from China. The fact that political legitimacy of those institutions is a lot weaker than advanced industrial
you think the count's higher?
Economy. Of course, I think it goes higher. We already have more cases of coronavirus than we did of SARS. And look, the mortality is comparatively low. But the ability of this to infect other people and spread is quite high. And so as a consequence, you're talking about needing to cut off a significant piece of the world's second largest economy from the rest of the world. And you already see a lot of airlines that are suspending flights. You've got 35 plus million people that are effectively under quarantine. Those numbers are certainly going to go up. I mean, I would say at minimum an expectation of half a basis point off of growth from China this year. That has an impact on commodity prices. That has an impact on global markets. And it could well get worse. I mean, of all the things we've seen so far in January, and it's been a pretty heady January, this has to be the one that is the greatest global economic concern.
The trust situation, just to come back to this, because this is where, maybe the lasting effect will be. So far, what do you think? I mean, do you think that we should be assuming the numbers are higher than what China is telling us? Do we see evidence of any kind of malfeasance thus far? Or are you just saying this is a risk point to where we're going to test really how much they tell the rest of the world?
It's less direct malfeasance than incompetence, weakness of the system. The fact that a lot of local leaders are very concerned about delivering bad news. That is true at every level of the system. China is not a system that is built on trust. It's not a system that is built on transparency. It's a hierarchical, authoritarian state capitalist system. And it's also only middle income. They don't have as many hospitals. They're a lot more rural than the United States. I mean, there's many, many reasons why you're just not going to get the kind of transparent data outcome. We know, I mean, every single person, they're saying that they have the coronavirus. They really have the coronavirus. So the danger of having bad data is not on the downside. It's not false positives. It's that you don't have enough data collection. You don't have transparency and capacity in that mechanism. So surely the actual numbers are a lot higher than they're presently being reported. That having been said, 30,000 people die from the flu in the United States, just regular influenza every year. So, I mean, we're not talking about a worldwide pandemic. We're talking about something that is going to have economic implications because a lot of commerce is going to be impacted.
Yeah. Ian, one of the things I hear post phase one deal is that there's a lot of doubts. There's a lot of, so I call it cynicism. Again, it just kind of strikes me as that because people in my side of the world from the investing community talk a lot about how China's not going to live up to the deal. It doesn't really matter. Phase one is all symbolic. I listened to Liu Hei's speech on the day of the signing. I thought it was profound. Am I wrong? Am I crazy to believe what came out of the Chinese message?
I think the deal, for as far as it gets you, the Chinese had every intention of living up to it. They recognize that if that's not the case, that there's bipartisan agreement in the United States towards a harder line against China, one of the few places where Democrats and Republicans actually do agree in foreign policy. Now, the coronavirus and the slowing of the Chinese economy this year may well mean that they don't meet some of their numbers in terms of the commodities that they're supposed to buy, they're on the hook to buy. Let's leave that aside. My view is that I just don't happen to think this deal is all that big or meaningful. Presidents that cut deals tend to oversell them. And Obama, for example, oversold the Iranian deal. It wasn't a deal that stopped them on ballistic missiles. It wasn't a deal that stopped them from supporting Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations. Instead, it was just on a narrow nuclear agreement. And so as a consequence, they said it was the best deal ever. A lot of people were disappointed that it didn't actually lead to a breakthrough diplomatically between the U.S. and Iran. What does that have to do with China? The same thing is happening. Trump is saying Xi Jinping's my friend. This is the best deal ever. No, it's not. Structurally, we have massive problems with the Chinese right now, not just on IP theft, but also on 5G, on Huawei, on Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs, on Taiwan, on the East, the South China Sea, many other issues. And you've got Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, just yesterday morning saying the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest threat, the biggest enemy of the United States. This isn't a Secretary of State that's gearing up for a phase two deal. There's no chance of that happening. So we need to understand, what this deal means in the context of the broader relationship between the two countries.
How would we describe the perhaps cushion maybe that at least this has provided, this truce or agreement, to the situation and relationship between these two countries, though? Because a year ago, in the middle of 2019, I was constantly seeing sell-side reports of currency wars, of Cold War, of possibly all-out war. I mean, it was like the sky was the limit for how bad it could get.
Yeah, again, when we killed Soleimani, people were telling me World War III was coming. My New Year's resolution this year was just basically to try to convince people that World War III wasn't imminent on any of this stuff. And no, there isn't a war between the U.S. and China, but there is a technology Cold War between the two countries, and that's happening right now. We've fragmented our technology systems. They have one set of standards and norms and infrastructure. We have another, and countries have to choose. That's not globalization. That doesn't facilitate efficient global markets. That's a bad thing if you're a trader. Right? And so I think it's important to understand that we're unlikely to see tit-for-tat escalation in tariffs between the U.S. and China. We need to trade with them. They need to trade with us. It's competitive, but it is win-win, where in technology, we're now creating zero-sumness. We're saying we want to kill their technology system. We'd rather it didn't exist. And they feel the same way about us. We're working towards preeminence. That's not a trade relationship. That's a Cold War relationship. That's what a Cold War is all about. And so what's happening is that you have two different levels of the global economy. You have the advanced AI, data, the cloud, deep learning, all the rest, that is a Cold War between the U.S. and China, creating a virtual Berlin Wall between countries around the world. And then you have trade in goods, services, commodities, and the rest between the U.S. and China that had looked like it was heading in a more confrontational direction, and now we're moving back towards let's find ways to do more business together.
Is it possible from that perspective to think about the next year and project outwards, Ian, if things are going to get worse or better? If you had to pick one side, is the Huawei thing a big enough glitch to potentially send tariffs back up or into confrontation? I wouldn't necessarily suggest that it's all about tariffs.
So even if we maintain tariff levels where they presently are over the next 3-5 years, what I'm suggesting, and I feel fairly confident about this, is that the U.S.-China relationship overall is going to deteriorate over that period of time. And we will experience that in many ways. There can be non-tariff issues that hit in terms of harassing American companies and Americans on the ground in China. You could see the Americans putting sanctions directly on a swath of Chinese officials, like we have with companies that have been involved with providing surveillance tools to the camps, the re-education camps that 1.5 million Uyghurs have been forcibly required to stay in. Those sorts of things, I think, are going to get more challenging.
Yeah. Let's talk Middle East. You just had a really interesting interview with Jared Kushner. There is a peace plan proposed between Israel and Palestine now, and it seemed like from the writing I read, from your perspective, that there's potential for some positives here. Overall, do we see this as a major risk point? Is it going to inflame things, or is this a potential area for de-escalation?
De-escalation in this case, so it's good that we're balancing it out with China. The deal, of course, was made without negotiating with the Palestinians. It's a lot easier to come to a deal when you don't have one side. But it's important to recognize that many Arab states have expressed their public support for the deal. The UAE, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, the Omanis, the Egyptians, and this for a deal that clearly is biased dramatically in favor of Israel. And that's because, number one, Israel-Palestine is no longer the priority that it was 5-10 years ago for most of the key players in the region. And number two, Trump has a good relationship with both Israel and with those Gulf Arab states. So I think you are moving towards normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab world, and that is much more important in terms of the future geopolitical orientation of the Middle East. But the Palestinians, of course, are getting screwed. That's not a new story. They've been getting screwed for decades. But the deal that is on the table for them is much worse than the deal that was on the table to them from the Clinton era. They're not going to say yes. And meanwhile, the Israelis continue to build settlements that now the Americans are prepared to recognize as part of Israeli territory.
Ian, real quick before we let you go, the Iran situation, again, one of those that immediately flared up speculation of how bad it could get. Then there was the tragedy with the Iranian plane that was shot down. By some logic, it seems that now Iran has really been just sort of dropped from this role that maybe it could have had from a risk point. I mean, are they hurting themselves? I mean, is Iran now less of a risk after these two major events that happened?
Well, quick correction. It was a Ukrainian plane that was actually down.
Sure, yeah.
It was a civilian plane. It had a lot of Iranians on it.
Yeah, thank you.
Iran is less of a concern today, and that's because the Americans have showed them that there is deterrence, there is a red line. The Iranians are the major adversary of the United States in the region, but they're not suicidal, and they don't want to precipitate their own regime change. So despite all the economic depredation that they have faced over the last year, in large part because of the American sanctions and the U.S. unilateral withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, they are not, I think you'll be very, very clear that the Iranians are not going to start whacking the Americans again for fear that we do more than just kill Soleimani, that we actually take efforts against the regime itself. So right now what they're going to do is, I would say take only very cautious steps towards further breaking the Iranian nuclear deal. I think that they're going to wait for the elections and hope that Trump loses so they can go back to the deal with the Democratic president. But if Trump wins a second term, there's probably no choice for this Iranian government but to sit down with them and try to negotiate a better deal. It's going to be really hard for this hardline regime to do. They're really in a corner. There are no good options for this Iranian government today, a country that, of course, has big instability with demonstrations on the ground and people that are increasingly unhappy that the government isn't governing them well. In that regard, the Iranians and the Palestinians are very similar stories. They're both people that have been governed badly, and the geopolitical realities of the U.S. and the world are boxing them into a corner.
Okay. Ian, great stuff as always. Pleasure to have you here. Always very good, objective, balanced analysis. Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Thanks a lot.